This being our last show of the year, I'd like to continue a tradition I started last year, talking about political books that I've read during the year that perhaps you should be taking a look at. Last year, my theme was just kind of my favorites. I had read a lot of books, and I talked to you about my favorites. This year, I want to be a little more theme specific. All the books I'm recommending, I think, are really good reads and very interesting reads, but I wanted to be a little more topical this year. And one of the topics that I think is important to be addressed is this inequality, income inequalities, and the resulting social inequalities that we were talking about. One of the reasons I picked that theme out is I was very struck in our first interview today with Clifton Kinney, where Clifton says, let me quote, "Young people have lost so much hope." That one sentence in the interview really got to me. Young people have lost so much hope. And the first two books that I want to talk about today really address that quote, I think. The first one is Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis by Professor Robert Putnam from Harvard University. And this is a story that we actually covered in an interview earlier in the year. So I'm going to refer you to our interview with Professor Putnam, where he talks about the effects of inequality and how that's playing out, and really how it's damaging the American dream, and so many kids feel disconnected from society. I think that's what Clifton was talking about. The second book, and I didn't have the first book with me, but I have all the other books today. The second book, The Price of Inequality by Professor Joseph Stiglitz of Columbia University. So again, The Price of Inequality, Joseph Stiglitz, Columbia University. And he's got a tagline on his book called How Today's Divided Society Endangers Our Future. How Today's Divided Society Endangers Our Future. So both of these books, Professor Putnam's book and Professor Stiglitz's book, are really dealing with this theme of income inequality, and I refer both of them to you. If these books don't look exciting when you're in the bookstore, find a book on income inequality. It's very topical, it's very important, and you should be reading about it. Now, one of my personal theories of how to solve income inequality is through education. Our education system is not what it used to be. Our scores internationally are suffering, and we've talked about that on a few shows. And I read a book this year that kind of fits that theme and, again, ties together with the inequality theme. So that book is The Smartest Kids in the World. The Smartest Kids in the World. That's by Amanda Ripley. And she's got a tagline here, and how they got that way. So she's not just talking about the smartest kids in the world. She's talking about how they got that way. And what Amanda does in her book is she follows 3 students who have traveled to Finland, South Korea, and Poland, and experienced countries that have really revolutionized education. And she takes you through the journey of these 3 students, and then she takes you through the journey of these countries. And my takeaway is that 3 countries found a way to not just fix their education system and demand excellence from their students, they found a way to do it relatively quickly. So whereas our country is going, I think, in the wrong way, in the wrong direction, one of the lessons from this book is that a country that really wants to focus on education and really wants to turn it around can turn it around very quickly and can get on a pace for excellence that I think our country has to get on. Another theme I want to introduce today is just one of my continuing themes about the fact that I think third parties and third-party politics is a direction that we have to get into to break the cycle of dysfunction and polarization. The next book is not about third parties per se. Last year we talked about Professor Whelan's book. We talked about my book, of course, E-Party. This year I want to focus on a book called Independence Rising. Independence Rising by Jackie Salit. I actually wasn't per se going to talk about the book as part of a show, but coincidentally we did a whole program with Jackie, and the quality didn't work out, and we haven't been able to reschedule her yet. So rather than, if we can't get Jackie back on the show, I'm going to refer you to her book, Independence Rising. It talks about the independent voters, independent voting movement, and perhaps this is where you want to end up. If the Democrats and the Republicans aren't doing it for you, and you want to be a truly independent, whether it's through a third party or just an independent voice, you want to read Jackie Salit's book. The next book we're going to talk about, which was covered on one of our most recent shows, is, of course, Diversity Explosion by William Frey from the Brookings Institution. Again, Diversity Explosion, William Frey from the Brookings Institution. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this book because we basically just did a whole show on the book. The show ran in December. It's now up on YouTube, and now's a good place to maybe to take a plug for our YouTube channel. You can get there by noneoftheabove.us. Noneoftheabove.us will take us to our new YouTube channel. And one of the more recent interviews that you can find there are our interviews with with William Frey from the Brookings Institution. I got professor on the brain here. Last but not least is another theme that we talked about last year with a book called The Last Great Senate. I think it's always good to remind ourselves how great our democracy was. It's still great, but you know, all this dysfunction and polarization, which makes me and you crazy. I think it's good to sometime historically go back and look at the origins of our country and the origins of our democracy. And the one book I read this year that I think does a really nice job of that is on Jefferson. It's Thomas Jefferson, the subtitle of this one being The Art of Power, and this is by John Meacham. So a book on Thomas Jefferson, but it goes back and talks about the Founding Fathers, Jefferson's role, his emergence as president, obviously his very interesting social life, etc. But if you want to get back to the roots of our democracy, and I think you want to read this book about Jefferson. So those are my recommendations based upon what I've read this year, a little more topical this year. But I think if you want to, dig down and think about solving dysfunction, figure out why we're polarized and some solution sets, these particular books are a very good place to start.